The lawyer smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't start with a thought, but with a procedure, a checklist item. Step 1. Establish rapport with a smile. He looked at the man sitting across the polished table. Mr. Davies, the bank's attorney, was young. His suit was dark grey and immaculate, the knot in his tie a perfect symmetrical dimple. He adjusted a cufflink. He said, "So, we are agreed. The foreclosure proceeds over the outstanding $200. His voice was smooth, reasonable. It was the voice of inevitable outcomes. He gestured to a stack of papers in front of the local branch manager, a man named Peterson, who looked unwell. Peterson was sweating slightly, despite the aggressive air conditioning humming in the small beige conference room. He avoided looking at the farmer. The farmer, Frank Cole, had said nothing for 20 minutes. He had just listened. His hands, weathered and clean, rested on the table. They did not move. He wore a pressed work shirt and denim trousers that bore the faint, permanent dust of the land he worked. Now he moved one of those hands, slow, deliberate. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a single piece of paper. It was folded into a small, thick rectangle. The paper was yellowed with age, brittle at the creases. He placed it in the center of the table. It made a soft, dry sound. He unfolded it once, then twice. The document was covered in elegant, faded cursive and the stark mechanical type of an old machine. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Promissory note." Frank Cole looked at the lawyer. His eyes were clear, his expression unreadable. "The bank owes me for this first." Silence. The air conditioning unit cycled off, making the quiet in the room absolute. Mr. Davies's smile faltered, replaced by a look of mild, professional confusion. He picked up the document. He held it by the edges as if it were a museum piece. He read the date. October 12th, 1968. He read the names. The lender, Thomas Cole. The borrower, Logan County Savings and Trust. He looked up at the branch manager. "Peterson, is this a joke?" Peterson shook his head, his eyes wide. "I've never seen it before. Logan County Savings was the name of our bank," he said, his voice thin, "before the merger in '93, and the one after that." Davies scanned the document again. The principal amount was $50,000, a staggering sum for 1968. He almost laughed. "Mr. Cole," he said, his professional calm returning, "this is a fascinating piece of family history. Really. But it is an internal matter from a defunct corporate entity. It has absolutely no bearing on a secured mortgage agreement made in 2019 with United Federated Bank." He slid the paper back across the table, a dismissive, gentle push. "Now, about the matter at hand. The $200 servicing fee. It was unpaid. Per the terms of your agreement, that constitutes a default. The bank has chosen to accelerate the loan. It's all very standard." Frank Cole did not look at the lawyer. He looked at the paper. He spoke to the paper. "It says here the note is payable on demand. I am demanding it." He then tapped a paragraph lower down on the page. "It also says this note can be used as a full and final settlement for any and all debts held by the lender, his heirs, or his assigns against the borrower, its successors, or its assigns." He looked up, first at Peterson, then at Davies. "You are the successor. I am the heir. That seems to have a bearing." Davies picked up the paper again. His movements were sharper now. The smile was gone completely. He read the clause Frank had indicated. He read it 3 times. The legal language was old-fashioned, but it was ironclad. There were no loopholes. It was written by someone who understood that a promise needed to be locked down from every angle. Someone who knew that banks, like men, could change their names and their minds. Davies placed the paper down carefully. He looked at Frank as if seeing him for the first time, not as an old farmer, not as a problem to be managed, but as something else entirely, something unexpected. To understand, you have to go back, not to 1968, not yet, just 3 weeks earlier. The letter from the bank had arrived on a Tuesday. Frank had been out since dawn, mending a fence line on the north pasture. The mailbox stood at the end of a half-mile gravel drive. He pulled the letter out, along with a circular for a hardware store and a farming journal. He didn't recognize the return address, a corporate post office box in another state. He opened it in the kitchen, the dust from his boots settling on the worn linoleum floor. The letter was dense with small print. It spoke of a new annual account maintenance fee of $200. It said this fee had been automatically deducted. It said his account had insufficient funds to cover the deduction. It said this constituted a default on his operating loan. The loan he'd taken out 5 years ago to buy a new tractor. The loan he had never once been late on. The final paragraph was the worst. It used the word acceleration. The full balance of $47,000 was now due immediately. If it was not paid within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. On the farm. The farm that had been in his family since 1889. $200. He called the number on the letter. He was put on hold for 22 minutes. A woman with a tired voice told him there was nothing she could do. It was policy. He drove into town. He sat in the same guest chair he was in now, across from Peterson. Peterson had been apologetic. "Frank, my hands are tied. The decisions are made at corporate now. They ran a new software analysis. It flagged your account, and the letters went out automatically. I can't stop it. It's the system." Frank had listened. He had nodded. He had said, "It wasn't in the agreement I signed." Peterson had agreed. "I know. They updated the terms of service last year. They sent a notice, probably by email." Frank didn't use email. He went home. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for 4 years, ever since his wife Sarah passed. She was the one who handled the paperwork, the files, the taxes, the warranties. He went into her small office, a room he rarely entered. It still smelled faintly of her perfume. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Her desk was a model of perfect organization. Pens in a cup, a neat stack of paper, a calendar still turned to a month from 4 years ago. He sat in her chair. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just felt he had to do something, to honor her way of doing things, her thoroughness. She always said, "The devil is in the fine print." But so is the Lord. He looked at the shelves, boxes neatly labelled in her handwriting. Taxes 1980 to 1990, appliance manuals, deeds and titles. And one on the bottom shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust. Bank business. He pulled the shoebox down. It was heavy. Inside were decades of bank statements, old loan papers, cancelled checks. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, was an envelope. On it, his grandfather's handwriting. Note from LCS&T, October 1968. He had untied the twine. He had unfolded the paper. He had read it. Then he had read it again. He sat there in his wife's quiet office until the sun went down. The paper felt heavy in his hand, a weight of history. A promise made between 2 men, one of whom was his blood, and the other a pillar of a community that no longer existed. He put the note in his coat pocket, and he waited for the bank to call him in for the meeting. 22 years before that morning, he'd stood on a hill overlooking the farm with Sarah. They were in their 40s. A developer had made them an offer, a big one. Enough to retire, to travel, to live a life free of the relentless demands of the land. They could sell, they could be comfortable. Sarah had been the one to say no. This is more than just dirt, Frank. She had pointed to the old oak tree at the edge of the property. Your grandfather planted that the day your father was born, and your father planted that row of maples when you were born. We don't own this place. We're just looking after it for the next one. That was her way. She saw time differently, not as a line, but as a circle, as a trust. She was the family's memory. She remembered the stories Frank's own father had forgotten. She was the one who had told him the full story of the promissory note. His grandfather, Thomas Cole, had been a hard man, but a fair one. He believed in a man's word and a firm handshake. But he also believed in paper. In 1968, there was a terrible drought. The crops failed across the county. People were pulling their money out of the local bank, Logan County Savings and Trust. There was a panic. The bank was on the verge of collapse. The bank president, a man named Harrison, came to the farm. He sat at the same kitchen table where Frank now drank his coffee each morning. He came not as a banker, but as a neighbor. He asked for help. Thomas Cole had just sold 100 acres of backcountry timberland. He had cash, $50,000. He could have bought more land. He could have bought a new herd. Instead, he gave it to the bank. It wasn't a deposit. It was a loan, a lifeline. Harrison had tried to offer him shares in the bank. Thomas refused. "I'm not a banker," he'd said. "I'm a farmer. I don't want to own your business. I just want you to be there next year when I need a loan for seed." So they drew up the note. Thomas Cole wrote most of the terms himself, sitting right there. He was the one who added the clause about offsetting future debts. Harrison had asked him why. "Because a man's grandson shouldn't have to pay for his grandfather's generosity," Thomas had said. Harrison signed it. The bank's official seal was embossed on it. The note saved the bank saved the town. Within 5 years, the bank was stable again. Harrison had come back out to the farm. He'd offered to repay the note. But Thomas Cole had shaken his head. "Not yet," he'd said. "Let it be. It's good to have an anchor in the water. Some things are planted for the next man." His grandfather had put the note in the shoebox, and there it sat, through mergers and acquisitions, through the death of Logan County Savings and Trust, and the birth of a dozen other names on the sign out front. The paper remembered what the computers forgot. The institution had forgotten its own history. Frank Cole had not. Standing there with Sarah on that hill, he understood. The farm wasn't a commodity. It was a promise, just like the paper in the box. Back in the beige room, the air was thick with unspoken calculations. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. He was trying to regain control. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Cole. For a document of this age, this magnitude, not to be in our records, it's frankly unbelievable." He was speaking to his own team now, the branch manager and a silent woman from corporate on speakerphone. He was performing confidence. Frank said nothing. He let the silence do the work. The paper sat on the table between them. It was the loudest thing in the room. Davies tried a new angle, a legal one. Even if this document is authentic, which we are not conceding, it would almost certainly be void under the statute of limitations. A debt that old is unenforceable. He leaned back in his chair, a flicker of his old certainty returning. That's Hornbook law. Frank shook his head, a slow, slight movement. "Not for this kind of note." He pointed to the paper again. "It specifies no date for repayment, only on demand." "State law is very clear on that. The clock doesn't start until the demand is made. I just made it." Davy stared at him. The man had done his homework. This wasn't a desperate bluff. This was a planned, deliberate move. The farmer knew the law. Or he knew this one piece of it, the only piece that mattered. The confidence in the lawyer's posture deflated. He leaned forward again. His knuckles were white where he gripped his pen. Okay, let's just slow down." He forced a smile. It was a weak, flimsy thing. "Look, Mr. Cole, Frank, clearly there's been a misunderstanding on our part.
This $200 fee, it's nothing. A clerical error. We'll wipe it. We'll wipe the entire balance of your tractor loan. $47,000. Gone. Let's just call it even. A gesture of goodwill for a legacy customer. He was offering to forgive the debt that had brought them here, the threat he had used as a weapon. He was offering it now as a gift.
He thought it was a generous offer. He thought it would be the end of it. He had misjudged the man. Again. Frank Cole looked at the lawyer. He seemed to be considering the offer. The room waited. Peterson, the branch manager, held his breath. The voice on the speakerphone was silent. Frank spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the stale air. The note isn't for $50,000. Davies frowned. Yes, it is. It says right here. Principal sum of $50,000. He tapped the document with his pen. Frank shook his head again. That was the principal. In 1968. He reached into his coat pocket and took out another piece of paper. This one was modern, a printout from a simple calculator. He slid it across the table. He had done the math. You have to read the interest clause. Davies picked up the old note again, his hands trembling slightly. He found the paragraph. It was dense. Interest on the principal shall not be calculated in currency, but shall compound annually based on the average per acre value of agricultural land in Logan County, as determined by the official county tax assessment rolls for each subsequent year. Davies's eyes went wide. He looked at the printout Frank had given him. It showed a simple table. Year, assessed land value, interest accrued. The numbers grew slowly at first, then exponentially. Land that was worth $300 an acre in 1968 was worth $8,000 an acre now. The compounding effect over 56 years was brutal. At the bottom of the page was a final number, a total. $9,243,500 and change. Davies dropped the promissory note as if it were hot. It fluttered to the table. 9 million. The word echoed in the silent room. It was an impossible number, a ridiculous number, a number that could bankrupt a regional branch, a number that would get men like him fired. The voice on the speakerphone, the woman from corporate, spoke for the first time. Her voice was sharp, metallic. This is a fabrication. That document cannot be real. Check the county records. There would have to be a filing, a UCC lien, something. It would have been recorded. Davies seized on the idea. Yes, a public filing, of course. He looked at Frank. Mr. Cole, do you have any proof this was ever officially recorded with the county? Frank Cole nodded. I believe you'll find it in Deed Book 412, page 88, filed October 15th, 1968. He had not raised his voice. He had not shown any emotion. He was simply stating a fact, like stating the color of the sky. The search was a pantomime of modern inefficiency. Davies got on his laptop trying to access the county's digital records. The portal was slow. He muttered about small-town bureaucracy. Peterson made a call on his desk phone. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones to someone at the courthouse. The woman on the speakerphone announced she was tasking a paralegal to drive to the Logan County Courthouse immediately, but it was an hour away. They waited. The silence in the room stretched. 10 minutes felt like an hour. Davies typed furiously. Peterson drummed his fingers on the table. Frank Cole just sat. He looked out the window at the small-town street. He watched a truck drive by, hauling hay. He seemed calm. Some men collect problems. He collected patience. Finally, Peterson put his phone on speaker. He had gotten through to the county clerk's office. A woman's voice answered. It was a voice that sounded like it was made of old paper and civic duty. Martha, he said, it's Jim Peterson at the bank. I have an urgent records request. There was a pause. Martha was not a woman who could be hurried. She had been the county clerk for 41 years. She had seen bankers like Peterson come and go. She had seen families like the Coles endure. "What is it, Jim?" He explained the situation. A note from 1968, Deed Book 412, page 88. "Can you verify it?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. They could hear the faint sound of a chair scraping on a stone floor, the rustle of heavy paper. The entire $9 million question hung on the word of a woman who likely earned less than the cost of Davies's suit. The weight was excruciating. Davies had stopped typing. He was staring at the phone. The woman from corporate was silent. Frank Cole continued to look out the window. Another minute passed. Then Martha's voice came back on the line, dry, certain. "Got it. Deed Book 412, page 88. It's a lien filing and a copy of a promissory note. Recorded October 15th, 1968. Borrower, Logan County Savings and Trust. Lender, Thomas Cole. The lien is against all current and future assets of the borrower and its successors." Davies slumped in his chair. Peterson put his head in his hands. Martha kept talking, a voice a relentless tide of fact.
The note was never satisfied. The lien was never released. It's still active. A pause. "That's a good strong lien. My daddy drafted it. He was the best lawyer in this county." She said it not with pride, but with the simple finality of a closed ledger. The woman on the speakerphone spoke again. Her voice had changed. The sharp edge was gone, replaced by a forced, brittle calm. "Mr. Davies, please thank the clerk for her time." She disconnected. A click, and she was gone. Davies was pale. The blood had drained from his face. All the confidence, all the procedural certainty was gone. He was no longer a lawyer executing a simple foreclosure. He was the man who had stumbled into a 56-year-old bear trap. He looked at Frank Cole. The offer to wipe the $47,000 loan now seemed like a child's apology. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole," his voice was hoarse, "clearly our institution wishes to resolve this matter."
The note. The $9 million. That is a significant liability. We would be prepared to make you a substantial offer to settle this claim. A very generous settlement. He was trying to open a negotiation, to turn this back into a world he understood, a world of offers and counter-offers, of finding a number that made the problem go away. He was trying to buy his way out of the hole he was in. He was hoping Frank Cole was like other men. He was hoping money was the point. Frank did not look at the settlement papers Davies was gesturing toward. He looked at the original promissory note, still sitting on the table. He spoke, and his words were not a negotiation. They were a conclusion. "There's nothing to settle. The note says what it says. You can pay it, or I'll take the bank. The lien is on all assets. This building sits on land that is an asset." He wasn't threatening. He was reading the terms. The terms his grandfather had written at a kitchen table half a century ago. The terms the bank had signed. The terms the county had recorded. Davies stared, speechless. He had no counter-offer to that. There was no legal argument left. He had tried procedure, he had tried law, he had tried money. He had failed on all three. The foundation of his world, the assumption that his institution was the one with all the power, had crumbled into dust. The room went quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning, which had cycled back on. It was blowing cold air into a dead room. The end was quiet. There was no shouting, no victory speech. The resolution was as understated as the man who had brought it about. Mr. Davies stood up. He mechanically gathered his papers, his laptop, his expensive pen. He put them into his briefcase. He did not look at Frank. He did not look at Peterson. He looked at the wall. He buttoned his suit jacket, a habit of professionalism that now looked like a hollow gesture. He walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the knob.
He turned, but only halfway. A legal team will be in touch, Mr. Cole. He said it to the room, not to the man. Then he was gone. Peterson, the branch manager, remained in his chair. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the last hour. He looked at Frank, his expression a mixture of terror and awe. Frank, I had no idea. Frank Cole nodded. He knew. Peterson was just a man caught in a machine much larger than himself. Frank carefully, gently, folded the old promissory note along its original creases. He slid it back into the manila envelope. He took the calculator printout and folded that as well, tucking it in behind the note. He stood up. He put the envelope back in the inside pocket of his coat. He walked to the door. He didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. The auction of his farm was over before it had ever been announced. He walked out of the bank into the afternoon sun. He didn't look back. The automatic doors slid shut behind him. Inside, Peterson sat alone in the beige conference room, staring at the indentation on the polished table where the $9 million piece of paper had just been sitting. Done. That evening, Frank Cole stood by the fence at the edge of the north pasture. The same fence he had been mending 3 weeks earlier. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. The land was quiet, peaceful. It looked the same as it had yesterday. It looked the same as it would tomorrow. He took the envelope out of his coat pocket. He didn't open it. He just held it. He thought of his grandfather, a man he barely remembered, a man who planted anchors in the water for the next man. He thought of his wife, Sarah, her neat handwriting, her quiet insistence on keeping everything, her belief that their life was a trust. He walked back to the house. In her office, he pulled the shoebox labeled Bank Business from the bottom shelf. He opened it. He placed the envelope with the promissory note back inside, right where he had found it, wrapped in its oilcloth. He put the lid on the box and slid it back into its place on the shelf. A promise made, a promise kept. He stood in the doorway of the quiet room and whispered to the empty chair, "You were right, Sarah. Keep the paper. Some men collect problems. He collected patience. And in the end, his patience had paid a debt that justice had forgotten. Not all debts are recorded in ink. Some are written in water rights." Stay with us. Next, we travel to Arizona, where a woman named Maria Reyes is about to unearth a water treaty from 1912. The state says it's a historical document. She says it's a contract. We'll see what holds